as fuel, and you can breed into plutonium, use that as fuel without even reprocessing it. So TerraPower's whole shtick is to be a breeder reactor, just like the breeder reactors in the 70s, but without needing reprocessing at all. We kind of said, hey, reprocessing is expensive, so why don't we just make a reactor that can and dispose of it? And you don't to the timeline, which was the actual question, certain. So it said 20 happened that have kind of gotten in the way of that cooperation in advanced nuclear affected our project, at least one of our projects. And so the timeline is pretty uncertain as we kind of step understand what are the implications of that and what are we going to do moving forward. So it's 2030s at this point for commercial stuff. At the end of the way.
The mic, please.
Sorry.
Okay, right now, nuclear reactor. This is something for reactor being, and right now nuclear reactors are closing down because upgrading them is too expensive, or they economically reduce.
Had made a decision to deregulate Texas, which that means your energy market, like free market things that they use, and so we're no longer like public utility type situation. And it was touted as being a big money. It doesn't necessarily work that way. But for the company that I worked for, we were vested in nuclear and fossil, but with nuclear we just had 2 reactors. But we had a whole lot of fossil, we had wind, and we had a whole lot of gas. And so the big thing was, well, you change this to the deregulated market, they can make more money, they have the wind plants that get tax subsidies, and then they have the gas plants that would run all the time, we had the coal plants, and so they just thought, we're gonna make all this money. Well, the nuclear facility was the biggest money maker for that company, and we just power along no matter what else is going on with everybody else. So if natural gas prices had not tanked like they did, they would have made so much money. So it was a financial decision for them that would have been great, but the price of natural gas dropped. We had the shale boom, it became super cheap, and that's actually some of the stuff that happened with the companies mentioned that went bankrupt. They also were what we called the merchant market, deregulated markets. That price of natural gas was so cheap that you couldn't justify these other expenses because the shareholders were making lots of money, or the people in charge were making a lot of money off this cheap natural gas. So it's harder to float these bigger things. So it's purely economical decision. However, the negative part is we don't know how long that price of natural gas is going to stay cheap. And all these other companies stopped doing upgrades. They did stop doing things like that. There's not a whole lot of them, but there were some really good performing plants that we lost in the industry because they said, well, it's cheaper for me to shut this down than to make these changes, and I don't need to do it, I don't have to do it, so I'm not going to do it. But the other part is climate change. So if you believe in climate change, then that means carbon is a problem, and you have to accept that carbon is a problem. And so when you are shutting down a power plant that is a good performing plant that has no carbon emission in exchange for natural gas, you're not fixing that problem. And so that kind of calls into question our overall economic perspective of the United States that, remember, for a lot of people, like I mentioned, power generation is a financial thing. This is a business. This is how we make money. Now, Energy Northwest is a public utility, TVA is a public utility, but a lot of these other facilities that are closing, they're not public utilities. They're there to make profit. That's why they make energy. And so it's hard to justify. And I've had a lot of my friends and family in the industry that have been at these plants that have shut down, and we're not going to turn that plant back on. Now, how do you fix that? So if we all agree that our goal is to lower carbon emissions, what we do is we value every source of generation that exists now and will be developed in the future for that carbon benefit. We say as a country, this is important to us. This is more important to us than profits. We need abundant energy that is reliable, that is also carbon free. And so we focus on policies and we focus on companies that do that. Now, it's important to remember, we're talking about technologies that we have today that we can show you that are operating. They're developing technologies that will take us there, but we also have a new generation of kids that are graduating high school, going to college, and we don't know what they're going to come up with. So we want to focus on carbon-free, not just renewable, not one type of technology. We want to focus on what gets us to what we care about. So when you look at wind and solar, like my old company, they got subsidies for their wind plants and they got paid for the gas. And so that's really what they did. But our nuclear facility did not get that same support and that same break. So that plant's still online, but I don't know for how much longer. I don't know how long that plant's going to take, and Texas really needs those units. So half of the company is getting all this support for their wind, but they're not getting it for this other piece. So they would shut it down if they economically needed to. I know the owner doesn't want to right now, but you have to be able to pay your bills. You have to be able to be profitable when you're a company like that. And if it's cheaper to do something else and you get more support for the government to do one thing, you're not going to keep that online. So that's kind of the primary thing to fix it. And that's what we're seeing happen in other states. New York has done this. Ohio, I can't remember if they passed it, but they were petitioning to do it. Value nuclear facilities for their carbon-free condition.
Yeah, I'm going to bring in the international perspectives that Nick had touched on, how he reached out to China and tried to develop that. There's also an international economy for small modular reactors or advanced test reactors. They're building them in states like the UAE, and other countries are winning those bids. In the U.S., there's a chance that we may be cut out of those bids if we don't start jumping on the ball and getting our technology developed. So that's something else to think about, not just domestic, but also the international economic implications of our own technology remaining competitive in multiple markets like she had touched on. So something to think about as well.
I just want to also touch on another perspective, and that is how we measure the economic value of something. And when I say that is, natural gas prices are cheap because when you go buy your natural gas, you buy the gas. There's probably no cost in burning it. But then we have a certain freedom to allow the waste product of that gas burning to just go into the atmosphere, that everybody then absorbs that particular cost. But as a person that uses it, I never see that cost. And so the economics for me is different. If you look at the way the nuclear power plant programs are worked out, end-to-end, birth to death, of everything that they produce is built into the cost already. That's one industry that's not allowed to say we are going to put these externalities of the end product onto the burden of society. So there's actually a cost built into the rates of a nuclear power plant that built Yucca Mountain. That was all privately funded for, if you want to look at it that way. It was money that was expended. There's a huge escrow account essentially for the waste products that we've all been paying on our electricity bills for the nuclear power plant. But the nuclear power plant is the only place that they have to pay for the back end of it as well. The decommissioning costs, the fuel storage, on and on, is something that's already built in the cost. So we could look at that and say, okay, so what are we really paying for and what's cheaper? Are we really saying that are they equivalent? And I think also if our priority sorry, I think, was that the hook? I wasn't sure. So if our priority is that we are polluting our environment with carbon dioxide, if we want to look at it that way, if we want to look at the externality cost of that, then we have to factor that into the way we use it. And we all have to pay that cost somehow. And we're going to either pay it through, what we're talking about now in the global climate change world, or we're going to pay for it. Actually, I would say our grandchildren are going to pay for it.
I chime in on that one too. So one other perspective, I agree with pretty much everything you all three said. As a reactor designer, we also focus on trying to find ways to bring operational costs down. It is expensive to construct and operate a nuclear plant, and there's a lot of room for improvement. Natural gas plant, gigawatt scale, it's $1 billion and takes 30 guys to operate it. It's a jet engine with a throttle, and you can just ramp it up and down. It's amazing. Where there's hundreds of people at nuclear plants, and they can cost $5, $10+ billion capital to build. So we're spending a lot of time thinking about, okay, how can we make these things cheaper to build and to operate and to decommission the whole life cycle? And it's not easy, and it's really hard to iterate because these things take a long time to kind of think up, try out, prove out, and then learn from. But there are some solutions. A lot of the companies in the film are working on these reactors that rely on just physics by using advanced coolants and whatnot. So you can actually, because you have physics to rely on, you can remove a lot of the safeties, the backup systems. And if you don't have to build or maintain those backup systems because you're relying on just simple laws of physics, maybe you can bring the capital cost down as well as the maintenance cost. But it's challenging. People who have built these advanced reactors have struggled to operate them cheaper than a traditional reactor so far. So it's just not easy. But it is something that we're working on, and it'd be great if people would value carbon emissions and the clean nature of nuclear, but we should also try to bring costs down as an industry.
Yeah, I can get behind the cost. I mean, I've been in the commercial side for a long time, and there's just a lot of stuff that we do because we've been doing it forever, and we may not need to do it. And so, we have tried to streamline as an industry, do away with some of those things, because the operational costs are pretty high by comparison to other things. I mean, we'll have over 100 security guards, which, we have a lot of security officers at nuclear facilities. Across the country, and some of it is absolutely necessary, but there were some decisions we made after 9/11 that probably weren't that great of a decision, and that includes, some remote power plants put in some defense systems for like the tiger teeth and stuff that were good at the time, but we also put up these giant concrete barriers, and so it's like, one or the other. So we did things like that, and then we came back and we said, we probably spent too much money there, and that was a collective thing. We could have spent it other places. Like, the security officers are a great team, and they do a lot of work for that they could take care of some of these other things that we had spent money on. And then we see just in our daily practices, like the amount of work it takes to just process a procedure, and we have literally thousands of procedures at a nuclear facility on how to do different things, which comes into like what my job does when somebody goes out and let's say we have some mechanics and they're packing a valve. There's a procedure for a lot of what they are doing, and it's a very detailed procedure. And if they don't always follow up to a T, they get to come talk to me about what happened. And so there's some of that stuff that is there to improve the performance, but not all of it is necessarily there for protection of the reactor. It's processes we have in order to be safe and specific. There are areas where we could cut back, we could make it cheaper, faster, better, to cut down those operational costs. And I'm just using those examples because they're with me, but I mean, it can take days to process a procedure, and it's not a procedure about how to operate the reactor, so it's not related to nuclear safety. It may be related to something else, but because of the systems we have in place, it's extra costs. We have been making process changes, we've automated a lot of stuff, but throughout our industry, you see these little things that we do it because we've been doing it since we built the first power plant. And so you bring in like our generation, and we're like, why are we doing this? And the next generation is going to come in and is going to look at us and be like, why are you still doing this? So there's a lot of room for improvement in how we do different things that will not affect the safety of the power plant and the public. Because remember, we live in the public too, so we care a lot about that. But,
Anyone else?
Okay. I'm going to state the obvious. The nuclear industry has a lot of emotional baggage with the public. You're trying to put in new reactors. There's a huge not in my backyard element. Also, the NIMBY element causes public pressure to close down reactors. Can this public attitude realistically change?
Well, the interesting thing about that public attitude is that's mostly your squeaky wheel getting the grease. Because I know people that live around our plant, and people that live around my old plant, most of us were perfectly happy. We loved the plant, we loved our jobs. Half the time you say, hey, there's a nuclear reactor there, and they're like, what are you talking about? So they either didn't know or they loved it. And then you have the anti-groups that are against it. So they are always talking. They're always getting their message out there. So I think a big part of it is countering that. Getting the pro-nuclear message out there is a big part of it. Because honestly, everyone that works there the nuclear plant is in their backyard, and they love it. And because they understand all the benefits that they're getting, the cheaper power, the reliable power, Our plant literally just was told that, hey, you can't touch the plant or do anything to the plant that could cause it to shut down. You can't turn the power down at all because of these winter storms we're having. So it was like, do not touch the plant at all. If you have maintenance, defer it. Because they knew it would operate and provide power when it was needed.
And we stayed online during that, and the polar vortex that just hit a couple weeks ago, we only had one reactor that shut down, and we've heard to trip for that type of power plant. It shut down because of ice in the water, and that is a solution they can engineer away during the next season. So that's one of those important things, is that during extreme weather, nuclear facilities typically stay online, so we do see a lot of support in our local communities. And as I mentioned earlier, I grew up in the shadow of a nuclear power plant. I have always lived next to a nuclear facility. And within my small town in Texas, everybody loved the plant. When we were growing up, I mean, that thing came in and took a town that had nothing but cows and turned it into a much more wealthy community. Now, it's not a big community. There's like 2,500 people there. And it's still mostly cows. But there's also good jobs for engineers. There's great jobs for craft personnel, the security officers. By this time, there's so many of my friends that came back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and they got good jobs to come back home to that were very reliable and very stable. And it's a financial powerhouse. We had one of the best school districts in Texas because of the money that this plant brought in. And so there's that financial security, the economics of it. And so when you are actually in a power plant town, and there are studies that the Nuclear Energy Institute has conducted that show that people that live around them, for the most part, there are some exceptions, people support it. And then when they find out that their friends and neighbors support it, they feel better about it. And we see that as people who support nuclear talk more about why they support nuclear, that they support nuclear, that number goes up of the approval rating. Now, for the people who do not support nuclear power, it really is about engaging with people. One of the things that my industry has not been good at is public outreach. During the birth of the industry, the philosophy was out of sight, out of mind, especially after the 3 Mile Island accident. We, for a long time, just didn't put any money towards public relations at all. And in my last company, we would go out and corporate would promote fossil side, they'd promote natural gas, they'd promote wind, almost never talked about the nuclear facility. And I would actually go to events, I would get invited by other organizations to go to events in Dallas-Fort Worth area. I would be there on the other side for like the Nuclear Energy Institute, and my own company would be like, why are you here? And I was like, someone else sent me. And they would have almost nothing about the power plant. They might have like a picture, but they wouldn't be like recruiting for engineers to come to the nuclear facility. And it was very weird and very frustrating. But essentially, we used grassroots efforts as our primary thing. So people like me and Blaine were the thing that they were relying on to go out. But it's not like my major. So I had to learn how to do these things. But it's also not as effective as a good campaign, because I can only reach so many people. Whereas you see wind and solar and fossil natural gas have TV commercials. They put magazine ads out. They put billboards up. That stuff's very effective. So that's kind of a key for us that we talk about in the industry, is that we have to reach out more. We have to talk to more people. We have to talk to them about what they're worried about, what do they care about, because the other thing we're really bad about is having technical conversations. We tend to get very, very detail-oriented, lots of numbers, lots of statistics, and that can push people away because we're talking so technically that they may feel like we're not really taking you seriously. Like earlier when we talked about the waste, we understand it. And so for us, it's easy to talk to about. But sometimes the way that we say it may make you feel like we're not really listening to your concern. And so that's something we have to practice and get used to, one-on-one and actual PR campaigns. And so that's one way to kind of turn people around on how they feel about it, is just helping them understand why we're important, what we do, and what we're doing to keep them safe, and what we're doing to help provide a resource to them, selling our product a little better, because I have said safety how many times, and I have actually been asked to stop doing that by other PR groups. We have to talk about our product, which is our carbon-free, reliable energy, and we just don't do that enough, and we're not great at it. So that's kind of the big thing, stuff like this.
Yeah, I wanted to bring the medical into the fold, and also a little bit of the international history of it. So with those nuclear medicine procedures, about 50,000 of them done every day. And the source comes from nuclear reactors from abroad, from Australia, from South Africa, and from Europe. And just now here in the States, legislation was put through in 2012 to go ahead and start up tech companies here in the US to start developing our own supply, because we were dependent upon the international community. They were dependent upon their government subsidizing it and the prices fluctuating. That impacted us as Americans in getting timely procedures. And then also, how many here travel abroad? Just raise your hands. So there's quite a few that travel abroad. So when you go to other countries, they actually do use nuclear energy more than the US. And there's an organization called the International Atomic Energy Agency, and they go ahead and support these, refer to them as states, to go ahead and build safe, reliable nuclear energy. And what we're trying to bring into the fold too here is with the small modular reactors like TerraPower and what they've set on the company there, go ahead and bring them into the fold as well, so that the US can remain competitive. The education and training for the next generations, even my children's generations, can remain competitive and won't lose that knowledge. Because right now, there's such a strong push against it that if we lose the knowledge, it's actually perhaps more dangerous in the future than if we were to keep ensuring that the next generation makes reactors that are safe, reliable, economically friendly, and that the next generation can take care of them in a way that's responsible.
So yeah, NIMBY is a big problem for a lot of different things. So it's really interesting. San Bernardino County, I read 2 days ago, banned the creation of new solar farms in the desert. That's the biggest county in California. I couldn't believe it. I had to read it twice. I was like, is this serious? And yes, the people there said there's too many dust storms from the construction crews out there in the desert, and it's hurting the wildlife. And so this is a situation where anything at scale is going to run into NIMBYism, and transmission lines, wind farms, solar plants, all those things, and of course nuclear plants are all going to experience NIMBYism. And I was shocked that the Californians are already starting to say, hey, no more solar panels. It just blows my mind because they've gone so in on solar. And the interesting thing is, as we ramp up carbon-free as a world, there will have to be massive amounts of new renewables and hopefully nuclear plants as well. And at those kind of scales, when you have solar panels literally everywhere and wind farms literally everywhere and skyscrapers the size of Columbia Tower full of lithium, you need several tens of thousands of those to do backup power if you go big on the intermittent renewables. You're going to see a lot of NIMBYism, even on the stuff that we all know and love. Nuclear in the United States has like a 40% acceptance rating right now. It's more people are happy with burning oil than running nuclear plants, which just, again, blows my mind. And so I think it can change, but it's going to take some guts. People are going to have to stand up and say, like, hey, here's why nuclear is good, and in fact, here's why there's some challenges with the wind and solar that everybody absolutely loves. It's not that they're bad, and we need a huge amount more of them, but when you ramp them up to a huge amount, when the sun goes down at 4:30 in Seattle, that's a lot of storage, and the implications of that are not easy. Bill Gates at a Stanford Energy conference last November, you gotta watch the YouTube video, it's unbelievably good, said that the people who say climate is gonna be easy to fix are a bigger problem than people who deny climate change at all right now. The people out there saying, hey, no problem, just ramp these things up, are a bigger problem because it makes people complacent. It's like, yeah, all right, we're good, no problem. And so, anyway, I think if the Bill Gateses of the world and the Jim Hansons of the world stay out there, those are people that a lot of people trust, and trust is key. Get out and say, here's why we think nuclear is good. I think you can start to see NIMBYism reduce. I talk to people in Seattle where nobody likes nuclear, and I've been yelled at and screamed at to the point where someone said, who's paying you to be up there saying that? I'm like, I just actually think this is a good energy source for these reasons. And not to say anyway, we need a lot, that doesn't scale well, like me at ADA's doesn't scale, so we have to find ways to do it at a bigger level. I would love to see a pro-nuclear billboard. You guys, come on.
Definitely. We're going to take that back and talk about that. We did, well, NEI did have a cool commercial they were airing for a while, and I really loved that, but I wish it would have been more. Yeah, I mean, the NIMBYism thing is, I ran into it a lot, because like I said before, the company I used to work for also had fossils. So we run into it every day. We go that you don't like something, but, we've had protests for all sorts of different stuff. I actually rarely ran into NIMBYism on nuclear until I got up here, and I was actually at an event that Nick was at, and that was the first time I'd gotten attacked. Well, actually, one time I was in DC, somebody called me a really bad name, but she was from here. And so it is interesting, but it is really, first understanding, is the person that's talking to you, and normally if they're yelling at you and calling your name, they're not open to discussion. Are they really, really curious? What do they really want to know? How can I help them? And if I don't have the answer, how can I get the answer back to them? But it's the other thing, and it's touching on the climate denier versus the solution to everything. They really are the hardest people that I advocate to, because they have an idea in their head that isn't backed up by a fact. And again, if I just throw a bunch of facts at you, you may get very frustrated with me. And so, facts are what we have to make our decisions on, but that may not be how we can guide the conversation. When I was in the South, or when I'm back in South doing things with people from that area, it is super easy for me to sell different types of energy to them to a point. Like I can, I had an easy time relatively in the South getting people to support nuclear power plants, because again, it's the economic powerhouse. And so when you're trying to sell something like this, or even wind and solar and gas and this, and you're in a place where you expect, but it's not necessarily the truth, people to be a little less likely to want to talk about climate change, you don't even have to talk about it. You just talk about the benefits of power, because that's what's going to get them. But if I'm talking to somebody who has already sold 100% renewable, that's a lot harder than trying to sell somebody who's already told me climate change is just a scam. I can still convince that person to support building new energy, because there's an advantage to it. But if you've already made up your mind on this one decision, it's a lot more challenging, because they call you a shill. I've been called a shill a lot of times. It's like literally not getting paid to do this.
Got a couple more questions, but I want to hit up the audience first. Are you ready to throw some questions at our panel?
Questions only.
Show some sort of signs of. Okay, we're going to take audience questions. The gentleman who raised his hand up in the far right corner.
I'm curious, especially around as we're in the Science Center and thinking about energizing the next generation. So many of the people in the movie that I saw, and your examples as well, growing up in nuclear and being interested in the industry. How do we get more kids interested in new technologies, and how do we tap their energy to solve the problems alongside us, the older folks of us? Their energy, their power, and all of their great thinking can go into this.
Condensed down, he's asking how do we tap into the energy of kids and get them more involved?
He's asking the middle school girls question that the speaker did not answer in the movie. That one. I know for us, we're both members of the North American Young Generation of Nuclear, and part of what we do is school outreaches. So we try to get out to all of our local schools for their science nights, career fairs, so we can get down there and talk to them. We hosted a Nuclear Energy 101 at our local Reach Museum out there in Tri-Cities, if you guys have ever been there, where we walked through how the plants work, answered questions from people in the community. Just those, I guess it's the grassroots that we talked about, is one of the ways to do that. But again, we need something bigger.
Yeah, I mean, pop culture is a huge power, and I watched MacGyver and Captain Planet and The Simpsons, and all those are super anti-nuclear, and it always, at the time I was like, all right, nuclear's bad. And I got interested in fusion before Spider-Man 2 came out, which is hitting on fusion, because Doc Ock comes out. But pop culture, I think, is it's the anti-nuclear sentiment in the media and in pop culture is huge and pervasive. And so it'd be nice to see some art along the lines of, it doesn't have to be pro-nuclear, but hey, let's do low carbon energy no matter what you guys can think of. Maybe there's something beyond fusion that we haven't even thought of. Let's make sure that people are asking that question, hey kids, how would you make energy? And here are the options, and here are their characteristics. What's the science behind it? Just to put that into culture somehow, I don't really know how. And there's so many anti-nuclear songs, some that are really good, actually. But there are no pro-nuclear songs I'm aware of, except that opera that you heard. So anyway, I'd like to see more cultural or art type stuff to get it beyond grassroots and into more of a mainstream. I'm not a great artist myself, so I need some help.
And Eric does have other songs now, though. Has a couple of other ones on his Facebook page.
Okay.
So you should check them out. Yeah, pop culture is a huge one because if you think about, how many movies can you name that actually look at nuclear energy in a positive light and doesn't tie into something with some sort of negative connotation? You're going to find very, very few. The last Godzilla movie was at 3 Mile Island. It was like, it's actually an operating unit. There's still people working there. But little things like that may not be that dramatic, but who walked away with a positive feeling? I watch a lot of horror and sci-fi, and there's a couple of horror movies that I've watched where they didn't literally say that the nuclear plant was the cause, but they definitely implied that it was the reason why there were man-eating bugs. And so it's like, yeah, we have that. I don't know how many times I've gotten the Homer Simpson joke when I say I work at a nuclear facility. But that's really good, is to kind of get kids to focus on what is positive about it, and that can get them interested. It's promoting, in general, because it doesn't just have to be nuclear, but any kind of problem solver. It's encouraging that curiosity when they're kids and giving them space to explore. Facilities like this across the country will help kids get interested in science. I mean, where I grew up, we did not really have things like this that were nearby. It's like 2 hours away in Dallas. And only if you could afford to go. And so that kind of exploration really stunts kids like that. And so we didn't produce a lot of engineers in my hometown unless they had been exposed to the nuclear facility or they had a family member who worked there. Those were the kids who typically went off to become engineers, were kids who had a parent that worked at the facility and their parents constantly talked to them about it. So that's part of why Blaine and I will do outreach. There's actually an event today hosted by Energy Northwest and a bunch of other companies came together in the Tri-Cities, and they do Kids Engineering Day, where we all come up with a booth that has something to do with a STEM field, and the kids come in and they play. And so little things like that stick with children and have them encouraged. But yeah, I would love to get more of that pop culture. And I know like the NAYG organization had talked about trying to get like YouTube celebrities to start talking about being pro-nuclear, because I don't know how many of you guys have kids that are in Generation Z. I have like the very first one, like he just turned 18, so I've got that like barely in Generation Z. And the heavy influences on him have always been who's on YouTube. He's all about YouTube and Instagram. So if like we could get a YouTube celebrity to be pro-nuclear, that would be great. And I would say for our industry, that's the place we need to be, is our presence on Instagram and YouTube, with whatever their sense of humor in that's really bizarre. I think we would do Fortnite dances with, I don't want to, but someone else would do it.
I think nuclear is sort of a niche. And, I look at this